share between us.
Like a little.
Hello. So we're getting. Okay. Welcome to Banned Book Week. We are going to start off with a conversation between Jill Bourne and Michael Meth. Banned Book Week is an annual event that celebrates the freedom to read with the purpose of placing the spotlight on the harms of censorship. This annual event is celebrated by librarians, booksellers, publishers, journalists, teachers, and readers. With me today is Tiffany Bradford Oldham from San Jose Public Library, branch manager of Hillview, and Dr. Roberto Cruz, Alum Rock branch.
Again, welcome to the first in our series of programs recognizing and elevating the importance of Banned Book Week. Banned books is a form of censorship, and the National Banned Book Week has been bringing these issues to light in a very public way for the last 40 years. In 2022, ALA's Office for Intellectual Freedom documented 1,269 demands for censorship of library books and resources, the highest number attempted book bans since ALA began compiling data about censorship in libraries more than 20 years ago. This unparalleled number of reported book challenges in 2022 nearly doubled the 729 book challenges reported in 2021. Censor Target did records of 2,571, unique titles in 2022, a 38% increase from the number of 1,858 unique titles targeted for censorship in 2021. And currently, on record right now, there is a large increase of numbers for 2023. So this number will increase when we see the data for this year. Libraries across the country create book displays, write blogs, and op-eds, and create programs to inform, engage, and increase awareness of the First Amendment and the freedom to read, and especially during this week of banned books.
We are pleased to introduce San Jose's City Librarian, Jill Bourne, and SJSU's Library Dean, Michael Meth. Thanks for taking the time to discuss Banned Books Week, the mission of libraries, and the challenges institutions are currently facing. I'll start you guys off by asking, what does Banned Book Week mean to you and to the libraries you lead?
Hi, everyone. You hear me okay? Thank you for the question. So Banned Books Week, I think as our introducing staff noted, has always been a way for libraries across the country to just really elevate the conversation around the work that we do and operationalize every day in terms of providing access to information across a spectrum of ideas and knowledge and beliefs, and recognizing that when you provide access to any one idea, they're part of our sort of representative democracy is that people may not agree with that idea. And so you could always have this situation in which there's going to be some information out there that you either don't agree with, someone doesn't agree with, or even worse, finds offensive to them in some way. And that is really a part of the work that we do. And how do you manage to provide information even in that kind of situation? And so Banned Books Week really highlights that narrative and that sort of complexity and almost like irony in the work that we do, which on a daily basis seems like it's all full of, you know, we always say rainbows and unicorns here at the library. Story times, children learning to read, people learning to code, you know, people getting access to their favorite books. But really inherent in the work we do is that complexity around when you provide information to all ideas, you may be, you know, conflicting with somebody else's belief system, and we have to manage that. It's just part of what we do. So to me, that's what Banned Books Week is an opportunity to celebrate and really delve into that inherent complexity in our work.
Yeah, all that and for me, Banned Book Week is really an important initiative that affirms freedom to read and just a freedom to think and freedom to speech. As libraries, we are, as Jill already indicated, at this nexus of knowledge discovery. And our job is not to tell people what to think. Our job is to represent our communities, to provide access to ideas, to divergent ideas sometimes from whatever norm may be established. And so we are in a space where we are trying to provide access and opportunity and let folks discover what they need to discover, quite frankly, for themselves. So challenges to reading are deeply problematic. And so Banned Books Week really is this affirmation of freedom. The other thing that I guess it also represents for me is that we are really standing on I guess the legacy really that goes back in ALA almost 70 years ago when the first group got together, and following the Second World War and some of the political changes that were happening, really came together and said like these kind of levels of censorship and thought control are not acceptable. And then a first statement was passed in 1954, and then since the early 80s, we've been actually celebrating Banned Book Week. And that's really, to me, affirmation, again, of what libraries have been through the decades, through the years. And also, you know, the other thing that Banned Book Week to me does is it happens not just in an American context, but in a larger societal context that in whatever regimes it has been, books have always been seen on the one hand as empowering, but on the other hand also been very threatening to some. And so looking at legacies of book burnings and other forms of censorship, this is very, very concerning. So we are entering an era where, you know, we heard some of the challenges, and it behooves us to counter that, in my opinion, to provide access to diversity of thought and ideas.
Oh, it's interesting that you talked about the history of Banned Books Week in that context, because, you know, one of the things I've always said is that when you read history and you talk about conquering cultures throughout history and ancient history, one of the first things they would do is destroy any libraries, right? Destroy the books, destroy the community knowledge, because it takes away something that is harder to replicate, and then harder to have that social identity or that community identity. And you and I certainly have not been around quite that long, but we both have hit like careers in libraries. And, you know, so one of the things that we were asked was what's changed during the course of your career in libraries? So I've been a librarian for, I almost don't want to say, like 25 years.
Who's counting?
I know, right? You can't believe it. I was like 10. But anyway, how long have you been a librarian?
I have been a librarian now for 15 years, I think.
15, okay.
Something like that.
I'm kidding. No. So, but it is interesting how it's changed and hasn't changed. You know, I worked both on the East and West Coast, but only on the East and West Coast, and not, you know, and other systems, all in large urban public libraries. And so, but I have seen the narrative around banned books. I mean, I think we're seeing it nationally, like was pointed out, like nationally, the traditional challenge to certain ideas, especially concepts or things that are thought to be too mature for some readers, potentially, you know, of a sexual nature, or like things like that have, or words that certain words that are considered to be obscene, always being challenged. Concepts that were thought to be anti-Christian, perhaps because there's an overt use of magic, like the whole banning Harry Potter, right? Mm-hmm. Things like that have always been around, and I think we've seen an uptick in that same type of concern. But I also, in my role as a children's selector, and I wonder if our children's selector gets this, it sometimes get the concern from parents who felt that materials were almost too traditional sometimes, right? And so that's that thing about, I am curious about, do we offer materials that represent a different time and how thinking was in a different time? And if that in itself, because it's different than how we think now, becomes sort of like offensive or outdated or just irrelevant, and do we maintain those materials in our collections? And I know in an academic library, I assume it's really similar, and that there's this desire to hold on to the history of what was written before.
Yeah, I was going to say that. So I think the big difference is that you came up through the public library side and I come up through the academic library side. And our approach to collections, I would say, is just differently, I guess, inflected in the sense that what we are looking for is building comprehensive collections on topics. And there is an understanding in academia that you are going to be presenting opposing viewpoints, that you are going to collect content from different vantage points, from different perspectives. And part of that is that in the discovery and in the problematization of the issues, you then discover new information, new ideas, new knowledge. And it's in that discourse that things happen. Now, I'm going to fairly admit this is also very idealized. It's not like we don't have folks who also think that maybe we should buy or should not buy certain things. We should hold on to some ideas or others. But there's certainly a historical perspective that I think we like to maintain in academia, the way we maintain our collections. And sometimes that means that we are going to be holding on to materials that are in the current environment are considered offensive, but were at the time reflections of the perspectives of that time. And what we do have a duty of care and a responsibility in that space, but overall that's where we come, how we treat it. Now, going back to your original question about trends, I think you're absolutely right. Like the acceleration of these book bans is really concerning as we see them too, right? And where we also see it is, if we step into a political arena, is that in some cases, these challenges are actually coming from government and from trusted sources. And we also see in academia that we have an opportunity and a responsibility to provide access to, again, ideas that are presenting different viewpoints, because in some places, their work is no longer safe to conduct. And so it is on us to maintain collections that provide, whether it's DIA materials in some states that are no longer permitted, or LGBTQ materials that in some states are no longer popular or permitted in some cases even. So we see we have a really important position in academia also to provide that continued access. So again, that this engagement can happen and the scholarship can take place.
That's interesting. That is interesting, because I think a lot about, we often have the conversation about, is something scientifically inaccurate? Is it, because for a while Pluto was a planet, then it wasn't, then it was again. And so you had to like get rid of all the books that had Pluto as a planet, and then we had to get them again, at least in children's books. So that's like obviously a non-confrontational or controversial example, but it's that sort of thing, right? Like if the majority of our society is, or we have sort of medically proven changes in how we see things, are materials that don't share that viewpoint actually spreading information that's incorrect and therefore potentially dangerous. That is something in public libraries we think about a lot, because providing access to materials, it's not a facilitated process, right? Always. And so do you want somebody to find information that's theoretically could be inaccurate and that could therefore cause them harm? And that's really hard to discern these days, right? Because whether you believe in like big medicine or whatever, you can almost find a study that says anything, which is totally off script, but I thought that was interesting. Yeah. What I wanted to ask you though was, what was like the biggest challenge you've ever had to deal with to a material?
I'm going to say, fortunately, I actually haven't had any big challenges. That's been one of the perks of being in academia. There once was a challenge that I had, and this goes a little bit back to the question that or the example with Pluto that you said. So we had something in our collection that there was some issues with the authorship and the study, and we got some pressure to remove it, and it was a very quick reaction, quick turnaround. One of the reasons why we ended up not removing the material was because it turned out that it was digitized and available online. And I think that's one of the things that we also have to remember, that we're just one part of a really complex ecosystem of information. And so whether it's information that has been superseded and now is no longer accurate, or whether it's a thought or line of thought that has changed in the way that people perceive it, information kind of, in my opinion, wants to be free. Information is going to be out there. There are plenty of mechanisms that make all kinds of documents and everything available. So really, I think we do have a responsibility to provide context where we can, where we do provide sometimes mediated service, although so much of what we do is unmediated. Folks can go in and they can browse the collection, or they can get online and search those collections. But at the end of the day, I think we also, it helps me anyway to contextualize and say, we're just one part of a large ecosystem of information where information is retrievable. And there is a responsibility on the individual to also learn to inquire and ask some of the questions about the why, and really to think, not just to consume and absorb. There needs to be a piece of also thinking for yourself, so to speak, on some of these topics.
Yeah.
But I would imagine you have some interesting stories to tell.
You know, what's interesting is the biggest conflict I recall actually was a SJSU event that I was here for early in my tenure. And it was an author who was whose works were considered by some to have anti-Semitic content. And the author was published through academic presses, not here at San Jose State, but they were a guest speaker. And so there were some protests, and some of you guys remember, there were protests. There was a lot of talk leading up to it. We had some threats on social media, to the extent where we actually even engaged with our local law enforcement, and they had plainclothes officers, which nobody knew, I don't think, but me. And, just because of the threats, online, just to make sure that everyone's safe. But what it brings to mind, though, and it was interesting because it was an academic press, we were completely supportive of holding the event. But that a lot of times the reason behind somebody wanting to ban something is something so deeply held, like the belief that somebody is being a Holocaust denier, and you have family who experienced the Holocaust, right? There are fears, there's feelings of being completely having the, almost being denied your existence in some cases, right? Like that people don't matter, that their feelings don't matter, or fear that something bad could happen in the future if we don't acknowledge bad things that have happened in the past. And so it's personal, right? So when you address an issue with somebody, you have to remember that fear is so personal. And it isn't always just about saying like they're right and someone else is wrong. It's like, I'm deeply concerned about something, and I'm really worried about other people getting the same idea, right? But the other side of it is that can be very, very political, right? So those types of feelings also can line up with certain belief systems, and as our political belief systems, and as a public library anyway, and I'm sure as academic library, one of the biggest challenges is that we are like we have to be apolitical. So I'm just curious if in a university, is it similar? Because I know like as a public library, we're a city department, politics is all around us all the time. Do university or academic libraries have to deal with that as well? Or is academia a little bit more shrouded in this idea that you get to have different ideas?
Oh, that's so complicated.
I put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, but it's good.
You can say, no, it's perfect.
It's perfect. Everybody come and hang out in academia with us. No, the reality is I think there are tenants in academia that try to create as much opportunity for dialogue as possible. But that notwithstanding, there are pressures that we all face too. In some cases, exactly what you said, like Holocaust deniers or other forms of denial, often BIPOC populations as well, LGBTQ plus, those populations as well. A lot of marginalized or racialized groups are often the subject of these kind of challenges. And I think a lot of it comes down to where the source of that challenge is. In some cases, I think it's maybe a concerned citizen or a member of the community. That's one thing. There's a different opportunity for dialogue to engage. And it's an opportunity, exactly as we should, to have dialogue, to discuss, to find hopefully a middle ground and find a way forward. However, there's also, we're seeing this in a lot of state-funded organizations that at the state level right now, the pressures are coming actually from a much higher level, and that is threatening funds. And that is having an impact on documentation, on language, on how people conduct research, where people conduct research, where scholarship happens. So I would love to tell you that we're immune to this, but the reality is, unfortunately, we're not as an industry as a whole, if you will, or as a field of profession.
Yeah. And similarly, I guess, not so much, it hasn't really hit us in California, but I think a lot of folks know that nationally there are library systems and state libraries who are being affected by an effort to have decision makers make decisions for libraries to limit access to certain materials, especially marginalized populations, and wanting to clamp down on what's made available around certain things like LGBTQ plus. I think the concern around critical race theory, all of those topics, and that there really are very real threats to funding and some libraries even existence because of this desire to not have them be open and public the way we are. It's crazy. So one of the things that we did here in San Jose several years ago was we started a sort of hashtag right to library. And you would think, like, even at the time, we didn't get a lot of challenges to material, but it was really around this concept of highlighting that fact that the idea of being able to access any information, and then how critical that is to both individual, but community mobility, community growth, is so essential that we wanted to to highlight that. And I remember, I don't even remember the person who it was, so I won't say anything about them, but somebody contacted us and said one of our staff thought that it was a little bit too controversial to talk about right to library, like it was political, like it was politicizing. And we were like, no, it's right to have any idea, like even not to like the slogan, right? Because we said join the revolution. That was what it was. It was too revolutionary. But our point was that it is still revolutionary. The idea that you could have a space that's supposedly so positive and helpful and sort of supporting growth for everybody, but you also might find that there are things that offend you. And that, I don't remember who it was, but one of my brilliant staff quoted somebody. It said, you don't have a right to not be offended by free speech.
In fact, it's enshrined in the Constitution as one of the
Correct.
amendments. I think that as libraries are core parts of a well-functioning community, in my opinion. Like, you need to have us as a space, as a place for discovery, as I mentioned earlier. And so with that, libraries, we need to be in a space where we reflect our society and our communities. And our society is not one-dimensional. There are different perspectives, different viewpoints, and you need to get access to that. Now, again, the internet is widely available, but there's a role that we play in libraries in curating content in the way we provide access. And we provide access in a safe space because there's also, you have a right to read free of surveillance. And other things that are enshrined in libraries in the way that we do as public good, whether it's on the public or academic side, that you wouldn't get if you go to a bookstore even, and you sign up for a membership card and your membership history can be viewed, all that. So absolutely. And then I think in that vein, there's also, I guess, a whole question about the role of libraries in providing access to diverse points of view and narratives. And I'm wondering, like if you have some more thoughts on that as well, just to kind of delve a little bit deeper into that topic. What role do we play in providing that access?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that, Mike. No. I mean, obviously, I think that we play a very active role, and I know some of our collection folks are here as well, that it isn't just about making things available. Actually, I talked about this recently. We had a large turnover of our elected officials. And one of the things I started with that to talk to them about is that the idea of access seems very passive. It's like you open the door and now you have access, right? But access is, for us, is an active verb, right? It is what you think about constantly, like how do you create access? And to do that, you have to make available all these ideas across the spectrum. You have to be seeking out perspectives that aren't represented in your collection. And again, even if they're not popular or even if they cause concern. And so, I think we're very practiced at it. We have a collection development policy, we have programming plans, like all of those things are really geared towards expanding access. I think one of the challenges we have now, and I'm curious your thoughts on this as a leader, is that, I think we all have seen content that we personally might make us a little uncomfortable, right? Or that you've read beliefs that I don't agree with. There used to be this author when I was a frontline public librarian, who I won't name, but it was just a virulent writer, political writer, who just was, I just thought they were just mean. The way they talked about issues, instead of talking about the issues, they were just mean-spirited. I could not stand them, but they were, of course, super popular. So it was like, I had to put the books out, I had to make them available, even though personally I didn't want to. But so, we're all human. We have our own beliefs, our own families, their beliefs, our concerns. So we're going to have, our staff are going to have those feelings as well, right? So how do you lead your teams? How do you lead teams of library staff? I won't just say librarians, to be able to embody that belief of this, like access being an active effort to seek out and make available a vast array of opinions about things.
Well, it is a challenge. And I think it's an ongoing challenge, like everything that we're talking about in this space. I think the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that there is the identity that we have as a professional identity, and then the whole person identity, also outside of the library identity that we have, whether we're at the librarian or staff level. And it's exactly as you said, I may have strongly held personal beliefs, but those are not necessarily the ones that I need to also bring to my profession, in a sense that I would censor somebody else from accessing content in there. So I think there is a balanced perspective that we ought to provide, again, because we are representative of the people and the communities that we represent. So we ought to be able to find that balance and present that. I think where we have opportunities is to create them programming, to create conversations hubs, where if you find yourself in a situation like you did, where you do put out an author that maybe you have some personal disagreement with, but you can create programming around that, where you can say, let's talk about it, like, what did you read in that book? What did you mean? How did you interpret it? And I think there's opportunity very much so also in surfacing that dialogue, because, my brain is only the brain of one. And if I have the ability to hear from others, it helps me be stronger in even forming my opinions, whether they're in further solidifying my own beliefs, or maybe there's something that I'm missing and maybe I have to come off my position a little bit. And quite frankly, I think there's also, maybe this is too trite to say, but I'm going to go there anywhere. It's like we live in a free country. And part of the benefit of living in a country like ours is that we need to engage with ideas that we might find like very, very offensive, very oppositional to where we are personally. But that's part of living in a democracy and living in a country where these thoughts can be expressed freely. And we're not just one homogenous mass of people that is trying to fit one particular thought stream. And then, sorry, just to close that one out, is, as I said before, for us to try to hide ideas, in my opinion, is not what libraries are about. We're not censors that way. And there's too much access available to information and ideas anyway. So for us to not participate in that dialogue means that we are excluding others from participating in a dialogue. And by doing so, we're further aiding that kind of siloing of information that's already taking place anyway. And I don't think that's the role of libraries, but what do you think?
No, yeah, I agree. And I was going to say, it made me think of the conversation we started with I think the biggest change I've seen in my career has been a social change around the comfort with a dialogue, a civil dialogue around issues of difference. And that I think we've all seen in the past decade, maybe less than that, but it can be attributed to social media and the creation of these kind of online tribes where you're fed the same information you believe in and start to believe that everybody believes the same. Also this sort of divisiveness, political divisiveness that associates also personal and social belief systems with politics. Mm-hmm. That there's a lot less willingness to have a civil dialogue like you just described, where I think that is a space for libraries, and we always have, where if a person voices a concern, I've always felt very grateful that they took the effort to articulate what their belief was and why they're concerned. And then the next step is that to be able to have that open dialogue, you have to be willing to hear them, even if you disagree, right? And then to be able to have that dialogue, you typically find that you can get to a place where a lot of times there's more understanding. There is, I've had many, many cases where folks have originally requested that an item be censored, and in the end, or that we take an action to block access to something. In the end, we get to a space where they understand why it's there, how we manage access, how it's appropriate for the person. But I think that part of the wave we're seeing nationally is partially attributable to this thing that there is currently a lot of times folks are, and I hear this from my staff, want to voice their opposition to an item, their desire to not have it be accessible, but don't want to engage in the dialogue. They're not willing to hear the other side. And that's kind of creating this, it creates a real problem socially, but also potentially a huge opportunity for libraries to step into that space if we're able.
Totally agreed. Libraries are not neutral sites, right? Like, we're not apolitical, we're not neutral. We step into these conversations and we make stories available and narratives available that otherwise might not be. Like, to give you an example, I grew up in Canada, and Canada has a horrific story with the Aboriginal people of the land, the Indigenous people of the land. That information, as somebody who went to high school in Canada, who grew up over there, was completely unavailable to me. I had no idea. And then in the early 2000s, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was formed. They did a 7-year inquiry, which ended up with some information being surfaced that the majority of Canada had no idea about. And now September 30th actually marks the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And there is a awareness that's been created about the stories of the original people of the land that previously was not available. And it's led to all kinds of positive change. Now, change is slow to come, especially when you're dealing with intergenerational trauma, and it was at the depth that it was. But previously, these stories wouldn't have had an audience, they wouldn't have had an outlet. And now we're seeing that Native voices are being heard, books are being published, stories are being published, oral histories are being published. They're sometimes in graphic novel format, sometimes in short, sometimes in long formats. There are documentaries. There's something that I don't think would have happened if it wasn't through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the many hearings that, many of which happen at libraries. Many happen in places where libraries were seen as that neutral site where you can have that dialogue, where you can hear, and people had stories to tell. There just wasn't an outlet. And to me, like, this is what this celebration of banned books is about. It's about finding ways to tell these stories that otherwise may not get told. And I look around the room, and I'm sure with the audience online too, there are so many people that have stories. They have their own personal stories, and there's reflection in what we see now. And when we look at the bannings of books, like what is being challenged, like there's a very definitive trend that we're seeing. And again, it's pretty much always about racialized and minoritized groups, whether they're BIPOC populations, whether they are in the LGBTQ, so sexual orientation and identity. So there's something that is very troubling for me as a trend when we're trying to suppress that there are real lived experiences that people are that are needing to be told. So yeah, we're not in a political space. We have a role to play, and we can shy away from that. And that kind of goes back to earlier, like we all have our own identities that we bring to this, but we also need to make sure that we are bigger than our own identities, because we have a professional duty in the way that we work as libraries.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting when to use those different terms. Like, I definitely agree that libraries aren't neutral. Like, there's a difference between neutrality and being political, right, or apolitical, or even politically agnostic, which I think we often say we are, because we have to deal with a variety of ways in which politics attaches itself to ideologies. And so, you know, how do we maintain the fact that we can represent all ideologies? It's difficult if you're becoming political as a library in some way, or attaching, you know, a political ideology. And in some cases, I'm just curious what you think about. You spoke very well about the fact that there's a lot of activity to ban access to certain types of materials that represent certain communities, certainly certain ideas. What does that mean in terms of representing the folks who disagree with that, with those ideals?
It's I guess, like, let me.
Do you know what I'm saying?
I think I do. Hopefully, I don't know. You tell me. But
I know, right?
I mean, for me, it's where I really struggle is when one group or individuals, however they form themselves, are trying to push their own ideologies on others. What I think this is, to me, again, where I think we are in this space where we don't benefit when we are trying to ignore and suppress these conversations. And so I think that's where, you know, it behooves us to, again, surface some of these ideas and ideologies so that we can talk about them, because they're going to exist no matter what. But I think that's where libraries can play a role in that conversation. And I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, it wasn't a good question, but it's complicated, right? So we have, you know, even in our communities, we have groups who are interested in not censoring materials from the collections, but having the conversation about, you know, being concerned about having certain materials available for children, for instance, especially in schools. I mean, I think one thing is, like, we don't represent, you know, the K-12 school system, which is a little bit different. And, you know, we've been talking a lot about what's the library's role in supporting that dialogue. And to your point, trying to make sure that there is a dialogue, as opposed to what can be a very divisive argument. And the fear that supporting free speech around things that make us uncomfortable is somehow going to have an ill effect, right? And that how do we as libraries continue to help support that, but while recognizing that we can't support, you know, we're not neutral, right? We support access to everything. So we can't support, you know, discriminatory language, discriminatory ideas. We can't support, I mean, certainly, you know, fights and arguments. I was going to say abusive language. So there's a lot of ways that we actually manage the idea of free speech in our buildings every day that we kind of take for granted, that there's certain things that aren't actually allowed. People can't say everything they want. But if you can cultivate a civil dialogue around a very difficult idea or things that people disagree with, that's a really meaningful role for a library to play around the concept of free speech.
Well said. Should we, at this point, turn?
I just made it up.
No,
So,
that was good. convinced me. Is this where we should turn over to the audience? I'm just being mindful of the time, and I think we want to leave a little space for Q&A before we go and wrap this up. Is that right, Estella?
Okay, so yes, we're going to open it up for Q&A if anybody from the audience wants to ask anything. Now would be the time. Anybody?
Well, while we're waiting for questions to come in, maybe I just want to use that moment while we have folks' attention to just say, Banned Book Week this year at the King Library, both San Jose State University and SJPL, is a full program. In 5 days, we have, is that correct, Estelle? We have 10 programs.
9.
9 programs, counting us. So the first one's just taken place. Estella will tell us about some of the other ones, but I want to say kudos to you and also to Tiffany for your leadership in raising this important topic and doing all the work that goes into organizing so many events. So thank you.
You. He gave you credit too.
Yeah, you get to stand up too. You can't hide. Do we have any questions on
Any
Zoom or in the
questions?
room?
Nothing up there? Okay. So later today, we have an Unbanned Author Series event with liberation narratives for a new generation happening at 3:30 in the same room. And then tomorrow we have a censorship conversation with SJPL and SJSU librarians at noon. And again, in the same room. So please join us and I'll be promoting it all week.
We do have a question in the back. Do we have a microphone for Keenan? Do you want us to run a microphone down for you so people can hear you? 1 second.
And I teach English and creative writing here at San Jose State. So my question is, to what extent do you feel that some of the division around or differences of opinion around ideas, censorship and so forth, book banning, to what extent it is generational, if there are some generational divides in the ways that perhaps people the age of many of our students feel about these issues, right? And to what extent they are, actually political, right? So
That's an excellent question. I can start, but since you have a lot of college students, I have one at home. Well, he just moved out, so that's good. But I do think, and I still remember being, being that age, and I do think that the passion towards just social justice, and I think we didn't really get into that, but there really is a connection between this idea of the library's role in supporting free speech and free access to knowledge. That is tied to the concept of social justice, right? Just intrinsically. And so that is a challenge that we face, right? Is that when you have a potential dialogue or information or materials or a book that pushes up against our feelings about social justice, about something that is just wrong, or that you feel is wrong as an individual, what is that like for staff? How do you have that dialogue to be able to say, is there a threshold where this is still a worthwhile either piece of literature and information, information, is it a video, is it whatever the format is this still a worthwhile item that we would select it for our collections, and since we're talking about banned books, it's more about collections, but also for programming, would you have that author speak? So there is a threshold that we've always used, and we didn't really talk about it, is what we call collection development traditionally. It is a form, it's not a form of censorship, but it is a form of selection of what are materials that are really that should be made available to the community, right? And, our typical threshold is always, if somebody requests it, that means somebody wants to read it. So we try not to be too, to judge in that way, but we're actively constantly looking for those materials. And the question is, is it factually inaccurate? Is it scientifically inaccurate? And then does it cross any of the lines of sort of legal free speech? That is, does it potentially cross into legal hate speech, which is a really high threshold, which is like inciting action? There are the things that do that. There are people that do that. So we do, in fact, exercise that judgment of what might cross the line of not being protected by free speech in terms of public libraries. I hope I answered your question, but I think that generationally I see it and remember just, I think that concept of really aligning with social justice and feeling the passion of injustice, there's a feeling that, we shouldn't be listening to some of these voices that are saying things that feel like hate speech. But not everything that's hateful is hate speech. Not everything that is mean is hate speech or is potentially harmful is hate speech. So we constantly have to be making those judgments. But it's funny that you said that, because I know a lot of, I would say, like, I think about my dad. I don't know if I want to call him a senior or whatever, who have their own views about what should be discussed. And, they might be on the same side or they might be different, but I think still that whatever feels like it's the right thing to people, which could be social justice, it could be their traditional values, right? Those could be generationally aligned, just to try to get back to your question. But I think that the reaction is very similar.
So I've had the benefit of thinking about the question now for a minute. And I don't have a good answer, but I will say this, I love the thought that underlies it, which is just, to see if there are sort of prevailing attitudes in certain demographics. And I guess the academic in me wants to do a research study now that assesses on a number of dimensions where these attitudes spring from and where they are most prevalent. And I think that would be an interesting slider if one axis that you kind of hold constant would be liberal to conservative values, right? Or open-mindedness towards full expression of theirs versus censorship, perhaps thought control, right? And then a few other dimensions, right? Exactly. So Jill, I don't know if you could hear it, but age, geography, religion and religiosity, political views, etc. And I think that would be a really interesting thing to see how that would cluster once you get a few of these criteria. And if I had to guess, I would say along with Jill that, there's generally, certainly in youth, there is a openness to ideas and a seeking of exploration. Whereas, as folks progress chronologically, often there's a hardening of ideas. I will just say as a personal quip for a second, which is, I love how some of the hippies of the past have become the conservatives of today. So, like crazy stuff happens sometimes. But if I had to guess, I would probably think that what you were saying is that there might be in youth you find more openness. But how you find youth, it's a word that can be interpreted on many dimensions. But I'm curious about it. It seems like something that like Pew or some other institution that does these kind of trends should investigate. I think it's a really great research idea, I'm just going to say. You want to say something else?
Oh, I was going to say, I bet you anything that amongst your Banned Books Week knowledge, you actually have like maps that show where the banned books incidents happen. And I don't know if you have them by age and demographics, but that
On the ALA website, they have it already.
yay.
Thank you. Hold on.
Thank you. So if we read the news the last couple of weeks here in San Jose, we're having the same topic come up at one of our local school districts, somewhere up along San Carlos. There's a school district, San Carlos Way, Drive, whatever. And so it's right here in the midst of San Jose where parents are objecting to books being in the library, and I think another group from outside town has come in. And so what do we do with that? Because it's right here, and how do we respond to it? How do we support the students? How do we work with the school district as they try to figure out what to do about the topic?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I think you're referring to their like K-12 school districts. Yeah. So, you know, at the public library, like I was saying, we have a really practiced team, some of them here, who are, you know, very professionalized in terms of how we take challenges seriously, how we vet them, how we communicate back and make decisions. The situation that you're describing is a couple different parent groups who are mobilizing around school libraries and school curricula, right? And it is different because, you know, kids are required to be at school. The parent isn't there with them typically. And so it is a really different space than a public library where we, you know, part of our narrative or dialogue with a parent who's concerned is to really encourage their engagement in selection of materials with their child, right? And that we don't get in the way of that. And we can help them, you know, work with their child to learn how to find the types of materials they want. It is different in a school setting. And so to your point, there's a couple groups that have are attempting to mobilize to express concerns about books that are in the curriculum in their school districts. Coincidentally, one is scheduled at a library community center. And so we've been having this dialogue about, you know, how do we ensure that if such a meeting occurs, that the conversation is allowed to happen in a way that fits with our inclusive, you know, community meeting room policies. And that means that to the extent that the dialogue is not offensive, or I shouldn't say offensive, isn't abusive, doesn't use abusive language, isn't use discriminatory language, isn't demeaning to any protected category. And of course, there's no physical violence or, you know, that sort of thing, that the conversation be allowed to happen. But recognizing that in a recent situation, one meeting was actually canceled in an anticipation of protests and very, very, you know, very aggressive sort of objection to the meeting happening. So we're not sure what's going to happen. I mean, we're in a different environment, but what you clearly see is that if there's an awareness that this conversation is happening, another side is going to come out. And we just want to make sure that the folks who want to have this dialogue do it in a way that meets with our policies around this civil discourse, and also that the folks who attend are safe physically. But it's a great question, and I'm glad you brought it up because I didn't want to. But it's it is happening. But again, it is really geared towards schools. Oh, and the other part of your question is we have strong relationships with all the school boards, so that and the schools administrations to help support if they need more materials or if they need you know, suggestions from some of our amazing book lists or that sort of thing.
So there's one question that actually came in from the LinkedIn streaming. And it says, what, if any, risk does AI pose with digitized publications of literature and books to ensure accuracy of each authorship?
Sorry, that takes us a different direction, but go for it again.
What, if any, risk does AI pose with digital publications of literature and books to ensure accuracy of each authorship?
Well, I have a really quick answer. So we're doing a lot of work in AI right now. I think the challenge there, like I said earlier, is one of our thresholds for including or removing something from the collection is it factually accurate or inaccurate, especially around topics of like health, you know, legal information, things that somebody could take and actually affect their life with. That is a reason to remove something from our collection. And so I think within the AI space, you don't really yet have those the quality controls, but honestly, this has been an issue for some time with self-publishing. You know, it used to be when you selected materials, they all went through a rigorous publishing process, and you'd still find errors, like Pluto was not a planet at one point, and they still published a book that it was. But for the most part, you had a lot more controls on the content. In self-publishing, we have less. And I think with AI, we would have even less with digital content.
Yeah, I think AI poses a different challenge and opportunity as we go forward. And I think it remains to be seen, but AI is certainly the ability, as you said, to create content at a rapid speed without necessarily having fact checking and verification. But in some ways, my attitude has been on AI is like that. What is the stand? First of all, like artificial intelligence, I think is a whole question itself. What does artificial really mean? Currently, we're working with large language models, which is really just statistical prediction, which is not factually based, right? But there's an underlying question of what these models are trained on. And so there are questions that then come out of that, because that is going to reproduce biases, for example, that exist on whatever they're trained on. They're not trained to critically assess the content that they're being presented with. So I think that's definitely one challenge that we're going to be facing as we move forward into this brave new world of AI. But the other thing that I think that's an important question we also need to interrogate, which is way outside of the scope of today's Banned Book Week conversation, is really like, what are the standards that we're going to develop for AI? Because as Jill just indicated, humans produce all kinds of misinformation also and pass it through as fact. So what is the standard that we hold this intelligence to? And I think there's just something that we need to really interrogate for ourselves and come up with some kind of a code and standard that also then distinguishes materials that are automatically generated from other content like that, as opposed to maybe human derived. And it's not a judgment of better or worse. It's just, I think that we need to be able to identify so that you can actually engage with the material coming from it from the right vantage point, so to speak.
Any last questions in the room? Is there any online? Oh. Well, thank you. We want to
you.
thank you, Jill and Mike, for taking the time and participating today. And there is books in the back. Please take one. There's sandwiches and chips and water. Please eat. And hopefully we'll see you today at 3:30 and tomorrow at noon.
Thank you, everyone who